So I've come for a nice walk on a frosty afternoon, and it's quiet, even though it's Saturday and the weather is very nice. This is part of my new direction, trying to really get my body moving again, but I'm very tired, I have to say. But what do they say? There's no gain without pain, I expect. That will be the situation. There are several, issues upon my mind, I suppose, at the moment. One of them in particular is my re-evaluation of Castaneda and his writings. I never took it entirely at face value, but I continue to take it rather seriously. But you see, I've followed so many people in my life, and all of them have turned out to be false prophets. And Castaneda is no exception to that. But nonetheless, a false prophet can speak much truth. And so I think it's my job, or our job in the world, to allow ourselves to be enthralled almost by false prophets, and then their falsity, is that a word, will be revealed, their falseness will be revealed. And it's only by really hooking onto them fully that one can glean the essence of their teachings, because these false prophets, they always have a valid teaching which is then contaminated. That's how the control of information control system works. They call it controlled opposition, but it's all controlled opposition. There is nothing that isn't controlled opposition, unless the title of that book is the authorized version of the Bible, or its equivalent in a local language. Everything else is some form of opposition, deception, but it doesn't mean to say that we should not understand what is being spoken of. I think it's very important. I've had various awakenings in this level. I was thinking back, one of the first ones perhaps was the continuum concept, actually, Jan Liedloff's book, which I would recommend to anybody to read if you're interested in anthropology and philosophy. That was a big seller back in the 60s, and I think it still holds its appeal to me anyway, which is mainly about child rearing and our relationships with one another. A very revealing and interesting book, and with some fundamental problems, because you see, an anthropologist always has the problem as to whether to examine the culture as something in itself with its own internal validity, or to examine it in the light of its departure from what would basically be Western culture for most of these writers. And it's quite a difficult balancing act, I think. And perhaps Jan Liedloff went too far towards identifying with the culture of the Indian tribe South American Indian tribe she was describing. Perhaps so, but it's worth a read. And then I got into Ayn Rand, for example. Well, I remember when I got into Ayn Rand, it seemed like I just read the two main books. I think I might have read a third one, and it seemed it was my introduction to philosophy, really. And when I mentioned it to my wife, she was very, very dismissive, that Ayn Rand was nothing to do with philosophy, and it was just, rubbish, and so on and so forth. But I found it compelling, and from Ayn Rand I got into libertarianism and free market capitalism and all these good things, and eventually Stefan Molyneux, another false prophet. But you see, Rand, it splits people two ways. If you look at the reviews of Rand books, people will either give them 5 stars or 1. That's quite common. Some people just have to adopt a complete skeptic stance in relation to Rand. And, of course, she deserves it in some respects. So she was a wicked person in her life. She became very inflated, very full of herself, and her ego was just the most important thing of this movement that she'd started. Her very poor treatment of her husband, and her enduring affair with, was it Nathaniel Brandon? I think I'm remembering the name correctly. Some very sordid things were going on in her life, and she was hardly, she'd set herself up really as being the judge and jury of this new movement towards libertarian and free market principles. But she was ill-suited to the task, of course. But anybody who reads Rand and understands it, or cares to appreciate it, will never be deceived by any kind of collectivist argument again, because she destroys them very effectively. And that's the value of Rand, although she has to be thrown out with the rest of them. Now, Castaneda is an interesting case, because he made a lot of money. His books sold extremely well. I don't know how many millions, but he would have made a very handsome pile of cash. And towards the end of his life, or after, well, I don't know towards the end, but certainly once he'd made his pile, he bought a big complex in Los Angeles, I think it was. In Los Angeles, a big building complex. And he set up a kind of cult center there. The movement was to be called Tensegrity, and it was a new way of finding knowledge by using these Yaqui techniques that he'd learned from Don Juan, and magical passes. And he set it up in conjunction with the 4 women who came into his life in the 5th book, apparently, who were effectively witches or sorceresses, woman sorceresses, but I think more witches than anything else. And it began to appear more and more likely towards, as I read the criticisms of him, that these people, himself first and foremost, but other sorcerers that he'd come into contact with, they were really just running little harems or whatever they're called, of these independent, probably very nice looking young ladies, and the whole thing began to acquire a tinge of, more than a tinge really, of absolute wickedness, just kind of decadence in a way that wasn't really in keeping with some of the higher principles that are enunciated in the mouth of Don Juan. It seems that many of the sayings of Don Juan may have been gleaned from works of philosophy or anthropology, and so plagiarized. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but I don't think it detracts from the importance of those books. Castaneda, in one place, he's touted as being the father of the New Age, and I think there's justification for making that claim. When you look at the numbers of books that he sold, I mean, it was massive back in the 60s and 70s, and many people were influenced by it, as was I. So, his ideas then did seed really into New Age. So what's the validity of them then? Well, the problem I perceive that Castaneda, at a certain point, went off the beaten track. In the early books, they speak of a concept called Nahual, which, although Don Juan says it isn't God, I think I could make an argument that it actually is God. It's certainly, it's the mystic. It's this force. It's the center of power almost, into which these sorcerers attempt to enter and to communicate with the Nahual. and this is an expression of their powers of sorcery, and it gives them powers, fantastical powers, to be able to interact with this realm. And I think, some of the reasoning there, I think it's pretty sound, to be perfectly honest. But by the fifth book, I think it is, or perhaps the end of the fourth, the Nahual has become a person, rather. And at a certain point, Castaneda himself is called the Nahual. There are other Nahuals, and they are what in the first part of the book would seem to be the people who are called benefactors. Suddenly they become Nahuals. And I think this is the problem. When you enter a realm like this, and you have no understanding of the authority of the Lord Jesus Christ, or the importance of kneeling before the cross, then you end up with this inflation. Now, whether that touched upon Don Juan himself, if he was a real person, I don't think there's any evidence to show that it might have done. But certainly the author himself, having set up this centre, and these women went to live, they all lived together in a sort of a commune. And I'm sure he would have been very wealthy indeed, very wealthy. He became a recluse. He wouldn't, allow his photograph to be taken forever, really. His identity was shrouded. So because everything in the world is controlled, you can't sell so many million books. Now, people will have to look up how many it is, because I can't remember, but it's a phenomenal amount. You don't sell them unless you're one of the controlled people. These things are deliberately put into the public consciousness, as it were, the collective consciousness. There is a plan behind them, you see. So we have to be aware of that, of these aspects, to understand that Castaneda himself was controlled opposition. That's what he was. But even knowing that, I think there is great value in the books, and I've enjoyed rereading them, and I would recommend that anybody should, who feels so inclined, to read Castaneda, to see what he had to say back then. He became quite famous. I mean, another false prophet, I suppose, Timothy Leary. Apparently, they met up, and Timothy Leary snubbed Castaneda, and Castaneda vowed that he would become more famous than Leary. Well, I think he might have, whether he's more famous or not, I don't know, but I don't think there's many people today reading Timothy Leary's books, or was it just one? I remember I read one book by Leary. I forget exactly the name of it, but it was, a seminal book in its day. But Castaneda wrote, I think, 10 or 11 books, and they're all still available on Amazon, and they're all presumably continuing to sell in one form or another. So Castaneda is he's an interesting character, but caveat emptor in all of these things. I like to rush in headlong. I've always done that with everything, because that way I get a feel for what I'm into. And then I pick through it and climb out a little bit. But, it's been very rewarding reading Castaneda. I haven't finished yet. I'm reading the 6th book. Whether I'll continue much longer, I don't know. But, the world of sorcery is certainly something. I mean, if you look at other cultures, I had a period of getting into Aborigine culture, for example, and you look at their concepts like dream time and things like that, and how they live, and I mean, they're quite inspiring. You begin to see parallels and understand that there is this spirit world. But again, it's very difficult to find out exactly what's happening, and there is only one true path. We do know that, I think, as those of us who are born again in Jesus Christ. There's no contest, as it were, but test all things and hold fast to that which is true. I think I'm misquoting that, but it's more or less that's what's being said. God bless everybody on this beautiful day.